So, with that brief overview of metabolism and prebiotics and probiotics, I wanted to move on to the idea of talking about einkorn. We've talked about einkorn, we've talked about wheat, but what is einkorn? What is wheat, actually, is a great place to begin. Einkorn is a type of wheat, but wheat is actually in the grass family, and as with almost any organism, the best way to understand it is in the context of its evolution. Species evolve together, and as humans have evolved and started consuming grains and farming grains, we have affected the evolution of those grains by becoming a selection pressure in ourselves. For human evolution, we look to our closest ancestors to see what parts of their diet changed over time as they evolved, and how distant or how closely related may we be. So, for instance, gorillas branched off from human beings millions of years ago and have a mostly plant-based diet. By far, it is predominantly plant-based. Chimpanzees, on the other hand, are much more closely related and have a 5% meat diet. And there is some evidence that as we evolved and learned to process meat, and processing in this case just means something like slicing, developing enough tools to cut meat, led to, or cooking actually, both of which yielded greater calorie absorption for less work. So in fact, some of the human head shape changes to having weaker jaws and a larger brain size were facilitated by having enough available calories with less work and less chewing effort put into the consumption. You can see that actually even in the animal kingdom, gorillas have to eat almost constantly in order to consume enough calories to maintain their bulk. Lions, which can be also extremely bulky in terms of mass, only eat in binges, and as in terms of percent of time spent hunting or percent of time spent eating are far, far lower than gorillas. Interestingly, both of those species, however, use large sections of their day for sleep to reduce their caloric demand so that they can maintain that bulk. Human beings are actually awake a larger percentage of the day, and our brains are very, very calorie hungry. And so having efficient food sources by processing the available nutrients like sourdough or slicing meat or cooking to make those nutrients more available became critically important. So the idea roughly is that about 2.5 million years ago, meat entered the diet of the species that were existing then, and about 500,000 years ago, cooking was widely available to increase the available nutrients, and you can see that on the slide here. Similarly, around that same time period, you can see Homo sapiens evolved about 0.2 million years ago, 200,000 years ago, and you can see that we interbred with Neanderthals up to about 40,000 years ago, and there was an increase in brain size as nutrients became more available. So as we started cooking tubers, cooking available carbohydrates, there was an increase in brain size, and then increasing dietary quality, increasing meat consumption further allowed for increases in brain size. This is additionally important because compared to other species, human infants continue to have brain maturation in the first years of life. So compared to other species, the growth after birth in brain development and brain usage is far more pronounced in humans than other species, again reflecting a increased need for calories for the mother in readily available, readily absorbable form. So moving on to wheat, here's a slide demonstrating the evolutionary derivation of wheat. As you can see, it is closely related to rye, barley, and oats, less closely related to rice, less closely related to millet and sorghum. Rye and barley, and oats actually, have forms of binding proteins that can work similarly to gluten, but don't actually have wheat gluten. That's why rye bread, 100% rye bread, often has an extremely dense texture, is because its gluten equivalent is not quite as extensible or as strong as wheat gluten and doesn't make for the same quality of bread. So wheat evolved about 3 to 4 million years ago from its closest common ancestor and was therefore present during the large sections of human evolution. So I mentioned we started eating meat about 2.5 million years ago. We started cooking about 500,000 years ago, and Homo sapiens, as we know it, roughly we estimate evolved about 200,000 years ago. Wheat, on the other hand, has been present throughout human evolution. So the idea that we would consume a substance that was readily available in our environment and learn to process that substance in ways that were beneficial to us is quite natural. This slide actually is a bit busy, but just shows the timeline of wheat evolution. In particular, I want to draw attention to einkorn wheat, which is Triticum monococcum in the upper right corner, evolved approximately 10,000 years ago from its closest ancestor, which evolved about 2.5 million years ago. By contrast, however, Emmer wheat, as well as other modern wheat varieties, are derived from a different line that split off about 2.5 million years ago, and in fact only came into existence about 500,000 years ago for Emmer wheat, and modern wheat only evolved about 8,000 years ago. Here's einkorn's evolution from its Triticum ancestor 2.5 million years ago. T. urartu evolved around that same time, but cannot interbreed between einkorn and urartu. They are too different to genetically interbreed, and that's important insofar as the modern wheat varieties are all derived from T. urartu, which is so different from einkorn genetically that they cannot interbreed. In any case, about 500,000 years ago, T. urartu had a wild hybridization event with a wild goat grass, and that hybridization led to a duplication of its genome, and that produced Emmer wheat, which was widely used for baking in Roman times. About 8,000 years ago, there was what we think was a human-instigated hybridization event with another wild goat grass, which led to the development of modern wheat. Spelt is a subtype of modern wheat. It has a reputation for health for some reason, though the reasons for that are mostly marketing. The important thing to point out is genetically, einkorn only has 2 copies of each gene. That gene is called the AA genome. After hybridization, the initial hybridization step that made Emmer wheat added a BB genome, and so Emmer and its derivatives are AABB, and that's 4 copies of each gene. That includes durum wheat and kamut as subtypes of Emmer wheat. Again, those are all tetraploid with the AABB genes. Modern wheat is actually hexaploid, has 6 copies of each gene, AABBDD, and that DD gene, which was from the second hybridization about 8,000 years ago, seems to be the part of the genome in modern wheat that codes for gluten that is the most immunogenic, the most problematic for humans. So Emmer wheat was even tolerated, and durum were tolerated much better on average, and we'll see some of that data as we go through. But modern wheat has this last copy of genes that seems to code for a version of gluten that is much more problematic. Some of the reasons why we chose that gene, why we selected for a hexaploid version of wheat, is related not only to farming practices, that's part of it. And in fact, that seems to accelerate in modern times with dwarf varieties and monoculture farming, which we'll talk about later. But also seems to be related to the strength and extensibility of the gluten. It's just easier to work with modern wheat. So modern flours, making them into bread requires less work, less effort, and less care, less technique than some of the older wheats. And that also is true for pasta and other wheat-derived products. It holds gas better. It can lead to lighter, fluffier products. Pastries, so on and so forth, are much easier to achieve with modern wheat, especially after refining. But that's largely due to the quality of the DD, as in dog, gene encoding for gluten. The other aspect of wheat genetics that's important for farming and why modern wheat has been selected is the ease of threshing. So einkorn wheat, as you can see in this picture here, is a closed grain. It has to be cracked open and the seed inside has to be obtained. Emmer wheat is less closed, and modern wheat, shown here with spelt, is free threshing, meaning you can just basically whack it and the grains come out, and then you just have to sift out the chaff. And so the processing method after farming was much easier than the closed einkorn seed.